All right, so I got an update here for you guys on the CHIPS bill, which, if you remember, was just that piece of legislation that passed a couple weeks ago, basically trying to incentivize U.S. corporations to domestically manufacture microchips here in the United States. So we on the left and members of Congress like Bernie Sanders had plenty of criticisms of this bill, pretty much because it seems like it's just another corporate slush fund, a handout to some of the wealthiest and most well-off corporations in the country and really in the world. And these companies have spent the better portion of the last number of decades exporting manufacturing overseas, gutting jobs here in the United States, as well as spending huge portions of their income on stock buybacks purely just to enrich their shareholders, while again refusing to make those domestic manufacturing investments. So I got an update here. Unsurprisingly, pretty much exactly what we predicted was going to happen is already happening. So here from Common Dreams, Jake Johnson, he says that Sanders blasts rigged economy as chip makers cut investments after big handouts. So what are they talking about here? They say news that the US semiconductor giants Intel and Micron are slashing manufacturing investments despite the recent package of a major subsidies bill drew the ire of Senator Bernie Sanders, the Senate's most outspoken critic of the industry handouts in the CHIPS and Science Act. And he said, quote, "This is what a rigged economy looks like," Sanders said on Wednesday, on the same day that a bill was signed into law to give a $76 billion blank check to microchip companies. Intel announced that it will be cutting back on plans to increase jobs by $4 billion while increasing dividends for its wealthy shareholders. And they say that the Vermont senator was referring to Intel's move to cut spending on manufacturing plant buildouts and other investments by $4 billion in the coming months, even as it continues to pay a sizable dividend. And they say, quote, "We paid dividends of $1.5 billion, a 5% increase year over year, and remain committed to growing the dividend over time," David Zinger, the Intel chief financial officer, said during the company's second quarter earnings call late last month. So you understand the dynamic of what they're doing here. I mean, this is not surprising. This is basically just how our economy works right now. These companies exist to serve the interest of their shareholders, even in cases where it means that they are doing things that are of a direct detriment to the actual productive capabilities of the company itself. So they're not making the investments in their workers. They're not making investments in further domestic manufacturing here in the United States. They're instead choosing to spend that money to buy their own stock to artificially reduce the supply and raise up their stock price, as well as giving those dividends to their shareholders. So even like from the perspective of a capitalist, this doesn't even make any fucking sense as an economic system or as an economic framework, because again, you are actively damaging the productive potential or the productive capabilities of your corporation to serve the shareholders. I mean, it just makes absolutely no sense whatsoever, and this is partially why stock buybacks should just be straight up illegal in my opinion. But they continue saying that led by lavishly compensated CEO Pat Gelsinger, Intel lobbied aggressively for the CHIPS and Science Act, threatening to move more of its operations outside of the U.S. if the subsidies bill wasn't approved. And President Joe Biden signed the measure into law last week after it passed both chambers of Congress with overwhelming bipartisan support. And they say that Sanders, the chair of the Senate Budget Committee, was the only member of the Senate Democratic caucus to vote no. And I think that he's 100% right. I mean, look at just this sentence up here, right? How ridiculous is this shit? You have the CEO of one of these gigantic companies with Intel that lobbied aggressively to get this bill passed. And this company has spent decades, which we're going to get to some of the statistics here in a minute, decades spending billions and billions of dollars on stock buybacks while exporting jobs overseas and refusing to make those investments here in the United States. And on top of that, they're openly threatening the government to say, we will continue moving our operations overseas to go exploit cheap labor and resources in other countries around the world if you don't pass this basically a corporate slush fund for our company. So understand, I mean, it's not as if they don't have the money to make those investments. They just have more authority than the US government has in something which the US government is considering a major national security threat, with supply chains being tied up in Taiwan mostly with their gigantic semiconductor manufacturer, TSMC, which is, in my opinion, largely or partially at least why Nancy Pelosi went and did that completely unnecessary trip. But I mean, you have a literal CEO of a capitalist enterprise here basically threatening the government that we are going to ship those jobs overseas unless you give us this multi-billion-dollar or $52 billion or $76 billion handout within this piece of legislation. I mean, it's just an absolute joke how completely cucked our entire government is to the private sector, but this is just another perfect example of that. But But they continue here saying that Micron, for its part, said last week that it plans to cut its capital spending meaningfully in the next year in response to worsening conditions in the chip industry and the global economy, the Financial Times reported. So understand, they're saying, oh, there's been worsening conditions in the chip industry while they're actively going behind the scenes and spending all of their money instead of on capital investments and domestic manufacturing, spending that shit on stock buybacks. So again, you're just completely lying. This isn't a problem of like you guys not having enough money to make these investments. You just don't want to because it's easier to ship those jobs overseas. It's easier to go exploit cheap labor in other countries. But they say that the company's announcement came a day after it hailed the passage of the CHIPS and Science Act and vowed to make good use of the law's grants and credits. And they say overall, the newly enacted law includes $52 billion in taxpayer subsidies and $24 billion investments in tax credits for the semiconductor industry. And in several speeches on the Senate floor ahead of the measure's final passage, Sanders blasted the legislation as corporate welfare, 100% right on that, and proposed amendments aimed at ensuring that the companies wouldn't use the taxpayer funds to reward shareholders, bust unions, and offshore more jobs. And every single one of these amendments that he introduced was completely destroyed by a bipartisan corrupt coalition of both Democrats and Republicans. So, I mean, again, understand the dynamic of what is going on here. You have these companies, right? Here from Jacobin, they provide a graph to put this in perspective, right? You have all of these different semiconductor manufacturing companies, Intel, Micron, the rest of these ones that are going to be getting these billions of dollars in taxpayer subsidies and tax credits. All of these companies have been spending tens of billions of dollars. We're talking about upwards of $168 billion between these companies between the years 2010 and 2021. Okay, $168 billion. And that's money that instead of being spent on these stock buybacks, they could have been spending investing here in the United States. But again, they don't serve the American people. They don't serve, even the government's interest in like our national security or whatever the fuck. They purely serve the interests of their shareholders. And that is 100%, again, a perfect demonstration of how fucked up this economic system is and how even under the capitalist, standards of what good investments would look like in a company, it doesn't even make any sense. You're serving the interests of the shareholders and putting that above the productive capabilities of your company. But don't just take it from me. We also had a statement directly from Joe Brandon, whose piece of legislation this is that he signed into law. But here we have a direct quote from him. He said, "A focus on maximizing short-term capital returns has led to the private sector's underinvestment in long-term resilience," said the White House Review of Supply Chain Resiliency published last summer. For example, the firms in the S&P 500 index distributed 91% of net income to shareholders in either stock buybacks or dividends between 2009 and 2018. 91% of their net income. And he said that has meant a declining share of corporate income going into research and development, new facilities, or resilient production processes. But his proposed legislation, the CHIPS Act, implies that the problem is actually that the semiconductor companies need more public money. So listen. At the end of the day, I 100% support actual major investments or increases in investments in domestic manufacturing, whatever industry that may be, whether it's semiconductors or something else. 100% you should get behind that, especially as a leftist, bringing back good paying, hopefully if the amendments that Bernie Sanders had been put in place, these would have been good paying union jobs that would have prevented these companies from busting their unions if they're accepting this money. I mean, you could have crafted this legislation in a way that would have actually significantly bolstered domestic manufacturing of semiconductors here in the United States, while also preventing these companies from continuing to engage in the same exact stock buybacks and shareholder dividends that we are seeing them do right now, continuing with their union busting tactics and continuing to basically fuck over the American taxpayers while running out the back door with billions and billions of dollars in free cash. So I mean, it's just completely ridiculous. Again, the underlying message of this is a good one, but true to DC form and how our politics operate right now, instead of doing something that was actually much more meaningful and substantive and had better guardrails in place, they instead basically just chose to do this massive corporate slush fund for some of the wealthiest corporations in the world who don't really deserve it. I mean, again, they're not short for cash, they're just choosing to spend their cash on things that are completely opposed to actual capital investments and improving domestic manufacturing here in the United States. So again, perfect lesson here in how fucked up the capitalist economic system is, where corporations are literally coming out and threatening the government or threatening the American people who work at these facilities that we're going to continue shipping these jobs overseas if you don't give us this corporate slush fund. So, I mean, it's just a completely ridiculous situation. Maybe some things will come out of this. Maybe they will, slightly increase their domestic manufacturing here. I know there's some facilities that are sort of in the works right now, but again, just another lesson in how fucked up and corrupt our government can be at some times. Even when they're doing things that are, nominally good things, they still have to add in all of these different corrupting influences. They have to add in all of these absurd and unnecessary handouts to the wealthiest companies in the world, while average Americans are still facing extreme austerity and underinvestment at a mass scale.